USS Squalus Diving Bell Rescue. On May 23, 1939, a brand new American submarine slid beneath the waves off the coast of New Hampshire. The USS Squalus was on a routine test dive with 59 men aboard. As she dropped below the surface, a main air valve that should have sealed itself didn't. The ocean roared into the engine rooms through a pipe as wide as a manhole. In the rear of the submarine, 26 men were caught by the flood. They drowned in the compartments where they stood. The crew slammed the watertight doors, sealing the flooded half of the boat. The Squalus sank backwards and settled on the seabed, 240 feet down. In the dry forward compartments, 33 men were still alive. The water around them was near freezing, and the air would not last forever. They released a rescue buoy to the surface and fired smoke rockets into the sea above. Then they wrapped themselves in blankets, turned off every light, and waited in the dark. In 1939, no one had ever rescued men from a sunken submarine at this depth. Every previous crew in their position had simply died on the bottom. But one man had spent his whole career preparing for this exact day. His name was Charles "Swede" Momsen, and the Navy had laughed at his invention for years. A steel diving bell, a rescue chamber that could be lowered onto a sunken submarine's hatch. Now his strange invention was the only hope for 33 freezing men. The rescue ship Falcon anchored above the Squalus the next morning. Divers descended through 240 feet of black water and attached a guide cable to the hatch. Then the rescue chamber crept down the line like a metal spider on a thread. It sealed itself against the submarine's hatch, pumped the water out, and the hatch swung open. For the first time in history, fresh air and hot soup came down to men trapped on the ocean floor. 7 men climbed into the chamber for the first trip up, then 8 more, then 9. On the final trip, the cable jammed, with the last survivors dangling in the dark between the seabed and the sky. For hours, sailors on the surface pulled the chamber up by hand, inch by inch. Near midnight, the last man stepped out onto the deck of the Falcon. All 33 trapped survivors were saved. It was the first successful deep-sea submarine rescue in human history. The men owed their lives to the inventor the Navy had once ignored, but the Squalus never let anyone forget her price. 26 men were still inside her flooded half, feet away from the survivors the entire time. Kursk Compartment 9 tragedy. On 12th August 2000, the pride of the Russian Navy sailed into a war game in the Barents Sea. The Kursk was a submarine longer than 2 jumbo jets, called unsinkable by the men who built her. She carried 118 sailors. At 11:28 in the morning, deep inside her torpedo room, a faulty practice torpedo began to leak. Its fuel exploded with the force of a small earthquake. 2 minutes later, the fire reached the other torpedoes. The second explosion was so massive that seismic stations across Europe recorded it. The front of the Kursk was torn open, and she plunged to the seabed, 354 feet down. Most of her crew died in those first minutes. But in the very back of the submarine, sealed behind watertight doors, 23 men were still alive. They gathered in Compartment 9, the furthest point from the destruction. Their leader was a 27-year-old officer named Dmitry Kolesnikov. In the cold and the dark, as the emergency lights faded, he took out a piece of paper. He wrote down the names of all 23 survivors so the world would know they had lived. His note said, "All personnel from Section 6, 7, and 8 have moved to Section 9. And then, none of us can get to the surface." On the surface, the Russian Navy knew something had gone wrong, but for days they told the world everything was under control. They refused rescue offers from Britain and Norway, whose divers were ready to fly in. Russian rescue capsules tried again and again to latch onto the escape hatch, and failed every time. Days passed while families begged for answers on television. Finally, more than a week after the explosions, Norwegian divers were allowed to descend. They reached the rear hatch and opened it in hours. The hatch the Russians had struggled with for days. Compartment 9 was flooded and silent. All 23 men were gone, and with them all 118 souls of the Kursk. Months later, when the submarine was raised, divers found Kolesnikov. The note was still with him. At the bottom of the page in the dark, he had written one final line to his wife. It said, "Mustn't despair." Investigators believe the 23 survived for hours at most, perhaps less than a day. No one can say whether faster help would have saved them, but the world learned what the men of Compartment 9 did with their final hours. They stayed together. They stayed calm, and they wrote down every name, so that no one would be forgotten at the bottom of the sea. Harrison Okene Air Pocket Survival. On May 26, 2013, a tugboat named Jascon 4 was fighting heavy swells off the coast of Nigeria. On board were 12 crew members, including the ship's cook, a 29-year-old named Harrison Okene. At 4:50 in the morning, Harrison was in the bathroom when the world turned upside down. A massive wave caught the tug, snapped its tow line, and flipped it over. The boat capsized and sank, coming to rest upside down on the seabed, 100 feet below. Because of pirate attacks in those waters, the crew's cabin doors were locked at night. 11 men never made it out of their rooms. Harrison was thrown through the flooding corridors in complete darkness. The water chased him from room to room as the ship filled. Then, in a small office space, the water suddenly stopped rising. His head broke into a pocket of trapped air about 4 feet high. Harrison was alive, in a bubble of air, inside an upside-down ship at the bottom of the ocean. He was wearing nothing but his underwear in water cold enough to kill him slowly. He found a bottle of Coca-Cola floating in the dark, his only supply. He tore off wall panels and built a small platform to keep his body out of the freezing water. Then the sounds began, splashes and movement in the flooded corridors, the sea's creatures entering the wreck. Harrison sat in absolute darkness, listening, praying, and losing track of time. In his head, he repeated the psalms his wife texted him every morning. He did not know if anyone was even looking for him. In fact, a dive team had been hired, but not to find survivors. After 3 days, they were coming to recover 12 bodies. 60 hours after the sinking, a diver's light cut through the black water below Harrison. Harrison reached down through the water and grabbed the diver's arm. The diver's helmet camera recorded what happened next. A hand, a living hand, reaching out of the darkness where no life was possible. On the surface, the dive supervisor's voice cracked as he shouted, "He's alive! He's alive!" They gave Harrison a diving helmet and warm water and guided him out of the wreck. But he could not simply swim to the surface. After 60 hours under pressure, rising too fast would kill him. He spent another 2.5 days sealed in a decompression chamber, returning to the world one breath at a time. Harrison was the only survivor of the 12. For years afterward, he was afraid of the sea. Then he made a decision no one expected. He trained, qualified, and became a professional deep-sea diver himself. The man the ocean could not keep went back, on his own terms. Pisces' 3 deepest submarine rescue. On August 29, 1973, 2 men climbed into a submarine the size of a small van off the coast of Ireland. Their names were Roger Chapman and Roger Mallinson. Their tiny submersible, called Pisces 3, was laying telephone cable on the seabed. It was boring, routine work, 8-hour shifts crawling along the dark ocean floor. Just after they finished their shift, as the sub was being pulled back to the ship, something went terribly wrong. A hatch at the rear of the sub was pulled open by a towing rope. The rear chamber flooded in seconds, and Pisces 3 became heavier than the sea around it. The 2 men fell backwards as their little sub dropped like a stone. It plunged for half a mile before slamming into the seabed. They came to rest 1,575 feet down, deeper than any human had ever been rescued from. The crew sphere had held, and both men were alive. But the math of their survival was brutal. They had oxygen for about 66 hours. Any rescue from this depth would take longer than that. The 2 men did the only thing they could. They made themselves almost stop living. They lay perfectly still in the freezing dark to burn as little oxygen as possible. They barely spoke, and they barely moved. Between them, they shared 1 cheese sandwich and a single can of lemonade. Their only food for 3 days. One lucky detail was keeping them alive. The day before the dive, Mallinson had fitted a freshly filled oxygen tank, purely by chance. On the surface, one of the greatest rescue races in history began. Ships sped toward the site from 3 countries, carrying other small submarines. Again and again, the rescue subs dived into the blackness to find Pisces 3. The first attempts failed. Lines slipped, equipment broke, and time bled away. Below, the air was turning sour and the 2 men were slipping toward sleep. Then a robot submarine called Curve, flown in from America, made one final dive. It locked a lifting line onto the sunken sub. Slowly, agonizingly, Pisces 3 was hauled up through half a mile of ocean. The men were thrown around inside as their sub swung on the cables. Then the hatch opened, and daylight poured in for the first time in 76 hours. When rescuers checked the oxygen supply, they went pale. 12 minutes of breathable air remained. Not 12 hours. 12 minutes. It is still the deepest underwater rescue ever performed. And it succeeded because 2 men had the discipline to lie still in the dark and simply keep breathing. Slowly.